They'll blanket you in Wi-Fi and profit off the radiation. Congregation collecting the people for that Satan. I keeps it blazing, cause I can read between the lines. I ain't blind, we unwind what they're really saying. Genetically modify what you're tasting. Don't need that cottage promise, so now you live up in your mom's basement. Redesign time so your mind is always wasted. Programmed to crave the basics. Keep the beta in stasis. Pay the state, kid. You're in debt for being born. Messengers are more than just the price for being warned. Don't be alarmed, disconnect from their machinations. Stop subscribing to the folly of own nations. Bone breaking ain't the answer, cause they seek the ownership of souls. Spread the seeds and watch them grow. Break the chains of control. Break the chains of control.
Sweet eternal balance of all that is good, true, and beautiful, friends. Tonight we have an absolute awesome guest on Rogueways as we are regaled with tales of the strange, unusual, impossible, and paranormal, with cryptids and fantastical phantasms aplenty coming straight from the mouth of an award-winning journalist and expert on the weird and wild, who has hunted werewolves, ghosts, and ghouls all across Britain and beyond. He's a skeptic and a believer, when the evidence is good enough. Author of many books, from Saints and Sinners in the Dark Age England to the mysterious Wold Newton Triangle. Welcome, Charles Christian, to Rogueways, and how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing fine, and thank you for inviting me on, Lindsay. It's great to be here.
Did I say it correctly? Wold Newton?
Yes, you did. Wold. Yes,
Okay,
yes.
Wold. Well, before we jump in and get started, I just always like to send love out to all the audience and all the people out there who love Rogue Ways. If you're liking, if you're sharing, if you're subscribing, if you're finding ways to support here on Rockfin, on subscribestar.com/rogue-ways, or at rogue.locals.com, all of my love to you. Anything you do is so helpful to the show. You're the reason that it keeps going, and so thank you for being here and being you. You guys are the best audience in the world. And so, Charles, I always start with a pointless question of the episode. And for you, I was going to ask you, what is the ideal type and number of pets to have?
Oh, you can never have too many.
Ooh, I like that answer.
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, we're down to 2 horses and 1 dog, but we did have a couple of other dogs with them. They all came from a rescue home together. And unfortunately, Anno Domini has caught up with a couple of them. So we've got 3 at the moment. But I say, the horses definitely won't be coming in the house and sitting on the couch.
No. Although I have chickens and I sometimes wish, I'm like, how can I make it so that they can come hang out with me in here and without it being a filthy, horrible mess, which I don't think is possible. But I love that.
We've got a bird feeder outside the front window, and one of the birds that comes up there about 2 or 3 times a week is a pheasant, big male pheasant.
Wow.
And it's preposterously balancing on there, teetering on the edge of the bird feeders. Thinks it's a sparrow or something.
Yeah, much smaller bird. Oh, that is so funny. I would love to see that. You know, I love that you got your dogs all together. You know, it's hard when they started together to break them up, and so not many people can take
that's
that
it.
many.
That's it. They said, you know, they came together and they didn't want to break them up, and there was a sort of pack regime there. But we looked at them and say the one who's left is a Chihuahua, so he's tiny. Well, he actually is fat, but he's tiny. And then the other one was a Dachshund, and then the other one was a sort of general purpose mongrel. Yeah. And all 3 of them together were smaller than the previous dog we'd had, which was a great big German Shepherd with an enormous long coat that shed everywhere. And years later, we're still finding clumps of hair. Surely we've hoovered under this couch since 1995.
Yes. That is the worst. I've found dog hairs from 10-year-old dogs I haven't seen for 10 years. And I swear I wash my clothes. So it's really, really interesting where hair will go. You just have little pieces of them no matter where. Well, I would love to hear about you growing up in a spooky house in North England and hear about your childhood and how you got into all of this.
Well, this is how I got into it, because I mean, I sort of grew up with it. The house was on the seafront at Scarborough, which is a seaside town, used to be a port. And the house was right on the harbour side. And so much so that when we had very, very high tides, the cellars used to flood. And the upper rooms, as is often the way with old houses, they get spare building materials and build something. And the upper rooms had clearly, the attic space had clearly been made from old ship's timbers. They have that sort of pre-used look on them. And they were very spooky, the attics. And a spiritualist friend of my mother's was round one day, and she was a bit over the top, but she sort of said, I can feel the sense men in large boots marching around above us. And of course, what I didn't know, but my father explained, was that his grandmother used to keep open house for any fishermen, sailors who were caught in the harbour in a storm, and it wasn't their home port, so they needed somewhere to stay. So she'd say, come on, put you up in the loft space. And fishermen of that era all wore huge, big, long wading boots that sort of came up to your thighs. So it made sense that there were men with large boots clumping around.
Wow.
Not so good for me because I lived immediately below it,
Yeah. Did you feel any presences or have any sort of scary experiences in that house?
Well, the scariest one I had was when I was lying in bed. There was a sensation of somebody tugging the bottom of my bed and shaking it, and jerking it backwards and forwards, and I'd sort of peer out beneath the sheets and blankets.
The safety.
There was nobody there.
Yeah.
Yes. There's a strange thing that if you put your hands over your eye and peer through, nothing can get you.
Yep, you're much safer that way.
Yeah. And there was nothing there. And I asked my father about it, and he said, it's just the wind hitting the side of the house, which made sense because the property stuck out from the rest of the property line of the street we were on. But it was only years later, when we were clearing the house and my father had died, my mother had gone into a home, and we were disposing of the property, that I, had cleared it all out. And it sort of dawned on me that if the wind had been hitting the side of the house, as was told, then the bed would have shaken me from side to side, not backwards and forwards. I was always a bit worried about it. But I say it's one of those old houses. The front part was sort of Georgian-y, and the back part we found when we were doing some building work was medieval. There were great big thick walls and all the medieval Tudor type timbers and things. And people had just been building bits on as they did in those days. So there'd be passageways that went nowhere. It just sort of went down a tunnel and it just stopped for no reason. And there was an old kitchen in sort of a sub-basement level that was hidden away. But if you undid a catch on a little small staircase, it all swung back to reveal this kitchen. So it was very spooky. I suspect it had more to do with smuggling rather than anything untoward. But I say, it got me, that living in that atmosphere.
Yeah, this sounds like some dreams I have, where we're living in a house and, excuse me, sometimes it's a house I actually lived in, and sometimes it's just a random house in the dream. I assume we've been living there all along. Anyway, I will find like hidden passageways and hidden things. Did you guys know there's just like a hidden section of the house over here? But you actually lived in a house that actually had those hidden sections in there.
Yeah.
That is so fun.
Though funnily enough, I've had those dreams as well, that
Weird.
You're living in a house and you go through a door and suddenly there's a whole part of the house you never knew existed.
Like a whole section. Yeah.
Yeah. Where did this come from?
Can we use this area? Like, is this? Yeah.
Why aren't we in there? Why are we all huddled up in one spot?
Excuse me. My throat is still recovering, it seems, from, an illness a little while ago, but I'll try not to cough into the mic too much. But yeah, I love those houses. I always want to live in a house like that, but then I also always, do I really want those energies of random, boatsmen and whatever other ghosts?
Exactly. You inherit an awful lot of legacy and history when you do that. You also inherit woodworm and awful repair jobs and things of that nature as well. And
True.
yeah. one of the reasons why we sold it. We just thought it's just getting to that point where it could be a money pit with so many things starting to go wrong on it. And
Yeah. Well, awesome. And so that was when you were young. When you became a teenager, it sounds like you went intentionally seeking some of these things.
Oh, yes. Yeah. I mean, I was at university and heavily into spooky ghost stories and things of that nature. And yes, I'd head out with a friend of mine who shared a house with in Leeds. It's a city in the north of England, and we'd go out looking for ghosts. We'd sort of read up where they were supposed to be, and then we'd go there, and we'd basically get very cold.
Yeah,
I'd see nothing.
That's like the life of a ghost hunter, right? Is just be really bored.
I think so.
Most of the time.
Very cold, not seeing anything. We did one of the things called the St. Mark's Vigil, which is a thing used to be a bit of a thing in the north of England, sort of going back Victorian times and before. And the idea is on St. Mark's Eve, and you would sit in the porch of a churchyard, and between the hours of about 11 o'clock and 1 o'clock at midnight, in the night, you would see the phantoms of everybody who was going to die over the coming 12 months marching into the church.
Wow.
And if they marched out again, that meant they had a really serious illness but recovered. But it was a thing that people would go there and they'd sit there. And there's some accounts you can find from sort of the 17th century of people sitting up in a churchyard waiting to see who was going in and say, that's him, that's our neighbour. And of course, obviously, the worst possible thing is if you see yourself walking in there. Because then
you don't want to see that, yeah.
No, exactly.
Did you end up seeing anything?
No.
Nothing.
No,
so no one died that year.
Nothing.
Is what you're really saying.
Well, I think what the mistake, we made a bit of a sort of schoolboy error there, and we hadn't realised that the churchyard there was no longer accepting new customers. So nobody would have actually being buried there. But I say it was only afterwards. But it was a particularly spooky, one of those old buildings where industrial grime has made everything black, and very spooky.
Ooh, well, in that time period too, 11 to 1 in the morning is it's not the witching hour, right? But it's supposed to be an hour, a time period that that things are thinner and more accessible on the other side. So that's interesting that that's the time.
Yeah, that's one of the chime hours when it's supposedly, as you say, the boundaries are thinner. And I say it's one of the things I discovered, that I was born a chime child. I was born, I think, 3 o'clock in the morning, which is another chime hour.
Oh, and, I've never heard of chime hours. I was born at 11 p.m. So
the chime hours were a medieval thing that they used to ring the bells to tell people what time of the day it was, and they didn't have detailed clocks and watches, and you didn't really need to know. But you would ring at 12, you'd ring at 3 in the morning, 6 in the morning, 9 in the morning, midday, and so on. And the monks in monasteries and things, they would have prayer services all throughout the night on these chime hours, as they were called.
Oh, that's interesting. I had never heard of that. That's pretty cool. Well, and then it sounds like you also looked for the ghost of Sir Walter and the Highgate Vampire during this time period when you were a teenager.
Yes, indeed. Well, bit of an old teenager by then. Yeah. So Walter was a guy who lived again in the north of England, and he was a historical character, and he basically, I think, had a nervous breakdown and attacked his family and killed a maid, killed 2 of his children, stabbed his wife but didn't kill her, then rode off to kill another son, but his horse fell down a molehill or something, and stumbled, and he was trapped under the horse, so he was arrested. And
good job, horse.
He realized, yeah, good for the horse.
Yeah.
But he then realized sort of the horror of what he'd done. And didn't want to do it, but he knew that if he pleaded guilty, then because of the nature of the crime, all his property would be confiscated, and his wife and remaining child would have been made homeless. And he also knew that if he pleaded not guilty, then the way the odds were stacked, he was going to be found guilty, and it'd have the same thing happen to him. So he refused to plead. And then he was subject to a form of torture called, I think the French is pain and forte, but basically you put a large door or board over the person and then put increasingly heavy weights on them to force them to come out and say, I plead guilty or not guilty. But he stayed quiet and died.
Wow.
And so his family didn't get made homeless, and he was buried, and one assumes in a very flat, long grave and the circumstances. And it was always said that the property was, the area where he lived was haunted by him, and that he would gallop out on his horse at night and charge around the countryside. And that there's a tale that in the 19th century, one of the houses nearby was a school, and the schoolboys did a ritual one day where they put all their school caps in a pile, danced around it saying, Sir Walter, come out and see us. And apparently he did appear, and the kids all ran off, and their caps were never seen again. So we thought, well, we have to go there and try it.
Yeah.
Again, nothing happened.
No dice.
But I say, but Sir Walter's fate is the same as Giles Corey in the Salem Witches.
That's what I was thinking when you were describing this. I was like, I read this.
He had the same thing happen to him. He refused to plead, and the same thing happened. No one could confiscate his property after he died, but he'd rather stay on and just take his punishment.
Can you imagine? There's a bit of redemption in that too. For you murdered, not a good choice, but you had some level of redemption, thinking of what you could at least leave behind.
Yeah. He tried to make amends, and I say the same with Giles Corey. He knew that didn't matter what he'd say or do, he'd be found guilty in the circumstances. So he would stay quiet, and I say his was really quite a despicable killing, as all the Salem ones were, because there were no witches among them at all. Well, the only one who was possibly was the native woman who started it. Something like Tabitha.
Yeah.
And given the times of they lived in, she was a slave, and so she wasn't punished because she was just regarded as property, and she was just sold to somebody else. So the whole person who did it basically got away with it, and everybody else who'd got nothing whatsoever to do with anything of that, they all suffered terrible punishments. And
such a crazy story. That's what I kept thinking the whole time I was reading this. It was like, no one cares about her at all. Like, this is not, but like you said, this idea that she's a slave. And I also wonder if she kind of knew that, and that was a kind of safety. And sounds like she got everything she wanted almost, and then got away as well. It was very different.
Well, yeah. It's very, 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 very strange. And I say that shows an odd, twisted mentality they had. Yeah. I mean, the other thing about them, about the Salem witches, is the ones who weren't executed but were still in prison. Some of them weren't let out until they'd paid for their prison fees, which is really adding to it.
Yeah.
and I think it was something ludicrous, like only 5 or 10 years ago that the state of Massachusetts finally passed a motion saying, "Yeah, we're sorry, we shouldn't have hanged them."
Took them quite a while.
Yeah.
Oh. Yeah, I hope they exonerated all of them. And I always was so, just disappointed in humans and our faulty logic that we could do this, where we say, because it seemed like all of the sort of tests were like, okay, if we throw you in this lake and you drown, you were a witch and you should die. If you float, you're a witch and we'll kill you. Like, so either way, you're going to die. Like, well, I mean, is this fair? So there's no chance for me to live. Like, okay.
If you sank, you weren't a witch, but the consolation prize apparently was that you would go straight to heaven, which you probably think, actually, I wasn't really planning going there that soon.
Yeah.
And yes, it was this strange thing that if you floated, this was because witches have thrown away their baptismal rites, and water is used in baptism. And so the water was rejecting you because of it, not the fact that you just happened to float.
Yeah.
A lot of people, I'd actually be quite good at that, because I seem to have negative buoyancy. And when I'm floating in a pond or in a pool or anything, I always seem to be about 4 inches below the surface of the water. It's not very relaxing, but I'd pass the test.
Yeah, you're not a witch, at least. Well,
No.
don't try this in the Dead Sea, because then everyone's a witch.
No.
Well, tell us about the Highgate Vampire.
Right. Well, this was a strange story, and I say it was in the early 1970s, and Highgate Cemetery. Back in those days, there were two halves of it. One part was reasonably well kept and looked after. It's actually the bit where Karl Marx is buried. And the other part was a spooky part that had never been used for years. And it had lots of Victorian mausoleums and temples of the dead and tunnels and crypts built off it. Very, very spooky and totally overrun with trees and things. And so that was closed. And there were always, I was living in London at this time, there were always rumors that people were up to practicing the black arts there. And there was a story sprang up that there was a vampire living there, and that the vampire was coming out at night and trying to seize people and take them. And it really got quite out of hand, and there was a sort of almost a flash mob with, on one particular night, several hundred people climbing over the walls to get into Highgate Old Cemetery to try and find this vampire. And I say it was a big cause célèbre at the time, and how dare anybody do all this? And I say a couple of people claimed to be vampire hunters and got lots of publicity about it, but in turn merely fueled it more. And then, probably on a copycat reason, some people did go into the cemetery and dig up bodies and apparently practice black magic on them. But whether they were actually practicing black magic because they were serious black magicians, or whether they were just vandals with a rather...
They wish that they were black magicians.
Yeah. It's that thing, you know. It's like when people write satanic signs on graves and tombs and things. It's not because they're Satanists. They just know that that's going to really upset people and annoy people.
So edgy.
Anyway, so edgy. Yeah, exactly. And so me and a friend of mine, we went looking around there in the daylight. Not that stupid to go around a spooky graveyard at night.
Smart. Yeah.
Yeah. And we actually found a tomb that had recently been smashed open, and there was a desiccated corpse in there that had been staked and set fire to.
Wow. People are insane.
I know. I mean, we reported it and we thought, oh, don't go there again. Certainly not after night. But that incident lives on. There's a not at its best Hammer horror movie called Dracula AD 1972. And that is based on that story of young people having a bit of a laugh. Let's try and raise the devil, or let's try and raise a demon. And lo and behold, they raised Dracula out from the grave. And then he's in sort of a swinging London type scenario with lots of dolly birds in miniskirts and things.
Yeah.
It's dated a bit, but it's got Christopher Lee in it as Dracula. So
that's fun.
it's good that way.
Yeah. Well, this is like, the first thing humans do. We're like, oh, there might be a deadly, paranormal, mythical creature. Let's go find it.
Yeah.
We're like, excuse me. That's just not what I would do. It's brave. I would love to, see some evidence. I understand that impulse. But, I'd be like you. I go in the daytime. But then to see this, what people had done also probably believing they were genuinely killing a vampire, but actually just desecrating the grave in the memory of a real person. That's just...
Yeah.
So sad.
No, I don't like that as a thing. It that form of vandalism, but I just think it's a bit yucky anyway.
Yeah. Well, and did anybody get hurt? Was somebody? Because I also then was thinking, oh, I bet someone went out and started like being a vampire and grabbing people and like making this story even.
No, we didn't. We didn't.
Good.
there was none of that. But I say there were various people doing things, and a couple of people got arrested for sort of desecrating tombs and things of that nature.
Well, why was that section closed down? I get that it was overrun but
it was overrun and it was derelict and it needed a lot of work doing on it. And it has now been, thanks to a sort of local charity, a lot of restoration work has been done. And it was the problem of trees growing up through tombs and overgrowing everything and making a mess of it all. That was a big job to do, but that has now been resolved, and now you can go in both sides and you can go down the various passageways and things where the Highgate Vampire was supposed to be. It was a small crypt of a tunnel-like passageway. So all very spooky.
Yeah.
And you don't need much imagination to think, especially at night, to think if there's vampires, they're lurking here.
Yeah. Oh, that is creepy. Well, tell us about the Wold Newton Triangle. This is your own personal sort of discovery and theory, right? Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, this is where I grew up. It's an area of East Yorkshire, and you get a triangle if you draw lines along two sides of the coast. There's a great big headland, so that's two sides of it, and then there's a road that goes down the middle of it. And really not very much happens on the one side of that road, but all the interesting stuff is on the other side, so within the triangle. And I say I was intrigued by it from way, way back when I was a kid, and we'd go out, as people did in those days, on a Sunday afternoon with the parents in a car, and you'd go out for an outing somewhere. And we were coming back one day and we went past this particularly run-down old property. And my mother happened to tell a story. She said that during the Second World War, the Women's Royal Army Corps, they were sort of women who were doing not frontline, but support jobs that previously would have done by men, were driving lorries backwards and forwards. And they were given special permission to go the long way round to avoid going on that particular road and passing that house at night, because it had such a bad reputation for being haunted and spooky. And what intrigued me was, this was a war, and one of the big issues was fuel for vehicles. And the military were saying, do another 40 miles on a round trip just to avoid a spooky house. Wow. You think, well, there's clearly something was seriously wrong, that its reputation was such. And I say that property still standing, but whoever runs it, and it's been a pub and it's been cafes, it's been all sorts of stuff, it's never a success. It always shuts down after 18 months, 2 years or so. And it's always up for sale, and it's just standing there. And I suppose one day it'll just become totally derelict and collapse. But I say even to this day, there's something odd about that property. And I say that was what whetted my appetite. And then, as you do when you start following things up, you think, well, there was that story about there. And then there's that thing over there. And then there was that thing over there. And then there's that story about there. And putting it all together, the triangle is just full of weirdness. And it's a sort of epicenter for supernatural activities. And in the middle of it all, rather incongruously, plonked now, well, not plonked, it was there to start with, but they built a Christian church next to it, was this huge Neolithic standing stone, and still there now. And it's sunk into the ground, and the ground, because there's been a graveyard around it for about 1,000 years, has risen up. But excavations have shown that in its heyday, it was enormous. And even today, it's taller than any of the stones at Stonehenge. Wow. And it's just there in the middle. And back in the Neolithic times, when there were no buildings around there, it would have been this huge obelisk standing out there in the middle of nowhere. And clearly some ritual importance, because the stone was dragged 20 or 30 miles from where that stone is found and erected there. And then subsequently, there were dozens, if not hundreds, of burials in burial mounds, tumuli, barrows around that area. Oh, wow. A lot have been destroyed by ploughing, the small ones, but the big ones, some of the big ones still remain there. And it's just, there was clearly something important for the people of that time in that area, that so many of them saw it as a place you wanted to be buried at. There was a ritual significance for it. Yeah. And I say it's continued on ever since, and just general weirdness about it.
Wow, that sounds so powerful. And the Christian church seems like it always will go just plop on top of places of earlier significance. And
yeah,
there has to be a reason, though. It can't just be, well, we want to cover over that, or we want to suppress that. I feel like they also know the energy of this place or the significance of it.
I think that there is that this is a magical place that people have been going to pray, and to try and get them to go somewhere else is going to be quite hard. So what they basically did when the Christian missionaries first started re-Christianizing England in the sort of 7th century, rather than destroying the old shrines, they would incorporate them within the Christian religion, and said, we still pray here. It's just that the name of the god has changed that we're praying to. We're no longer praying to Woden. We're praying to God and Jesus. And, we still have the feasts, but they're now called Saints' Days. And it was an easy way of getting people to accept the religion. And so you find a lot of sites that were sacred in Neolithic times or, pre-Roman times that are now Christian sites.
And then it would be interesting to know, too, if those churches have, hauntings or strange things happen, or, if there's some anger from that area's energy or spirits at them coming in and doing that. And I don't know if you've heard of any of that, but that would be interesting, too.
No, what I found looking at them, and there's where I'm living now, there's one not very far from where I live, and there was a Christian church there. It fell into ruins a long time ago, but it was built on a site that had previously been a Saxon churchyard, graveyard, and that in turn was built in the middle of a former Roman camp, and that would have had a temple there to Mithras or someone of that nature. And that in turn was built on a site that was sacred to the local Britons who lived there, and the Romans put the camp there to sort of keep them in control. So the church has got a relatively short history, but the prehistory of the site goes back 1,000, 2,000 years. And when you go there, you don't feel that it's angry or oppressive. You just feel that there's just a sense of place about it. There's just some sort of feeling about it that gets you, that, you know, and makes you think, you know, people have been coming here of various creeds and religions to worship for thousands of years.
Yeah, they've just imbued it with an energy, even if it didn't have any of its own.
Yeah.
But we also see, like you said, there's this sense of place and sometimes an energy about certain places. And I know some people talk about ley lines and how these can, you know, converge in certain places. And there's this energy here because of that. It took me so long to understand that ley lines weren't just this magical current, but that there's actually water running underground, and that is what creates the ley line. And you mentioned ley lines in this weird East Yorkshire wolds.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tell us about that.
This is it. Because, well, the big stone, it's at a place called Rudston, and the monolith there is actually the end of a ley line, and there's one that goes straight line from to the southwest, right across a lot of ancient sites in the country. I think it goes through Stonehenge as well before running into the sea. And going in the opposite direction, there's a ley line that heads to the northwest and ends on a mountaintop where there is an ancient stone circle. So you really are in sort of an energy field.
Wow.
And as it's one, you know, it's on one of the most important ley lines in the country. And there is a running water thing because the whole area is on limestone. And with limestone, you get underground rivers because the water dissolves the stone away, and then you get this these subterranean rivers. But when there's been very, very heavy rain or, you know, a snow melt, the water will bubble up through the earth. You know, the underground aquifers are full, and so you will have the river appearing. And there is a river that runs all the way through what I call the Wold Newton Triangle, going right past Rudston, and it's one of those underground ones it's called the Gypsy Race, and most of the time there's nothing there, but then sometimes suddenly there is a flowing torrent, and, you know, and there's, on some bad floods, it's swept away houses and caused damage, and then it just disappears again.
Wow.
And I say, it's picked up a reputation called the Waters of Woe, and it's said that every time it flows, it's been when there's been a momentous occasion, such as the death of Princess Diana, the start of the Second World War, start of the First World War, and people going right back into the sort of 19th and 18th century, and they've said, oh, that was the year the Waters of Woe were flowing. No wonder there was bad luck that year.
Oh, wow. They belong underground, and once they come above ground, they don't bring good things with them.
No, indeed. No. And I say, you can understand why, if you were, as most people were in those days, sort of illiterate peasants, you'd think there was something magical about it. You know, you wouldn't understand about the way limestone works or anything, and the effect of water on it. And you'd be... you really would be astonished. You would think it was, you know, divine or demonic causation behind it. Definitely. And, you know, you'd think there's something special about this place.
Yes.
And I think that's probably why they put the monolith there in the first place, to sort of celebrate it. It's right in the center of it. And I say, there's all these other ancient earthworks and things. So I say, very, very, very mysterious area.
Yeah. I feel like you're so lucky, over there in, England. There's so many ancient sites. And here in America, we have the ancient sites. Many of them have been lost or covered over, and we just don't have the same history. I went to the East Coast and I was like, wow, things are old. And then I went over to Europe and England. I was like, oh my God, things are really old. You have a whole different time frame there. And it must be so fun to walk around and see all that and feel it and be in connection with it.
No, it is. And yes, like that old Ozzy Osbourne story when he was caught urinating on the Alamo. And they said, you're urinating on a sacred ancient monument. And he said, this is old. We've got public toilets in England that are older than this building.
That's true.
But it is like that, it goes back centuries, and they're everywhere. And I think we don't realize how lucky we are that we've got so much of this stuff here. It's just everywhere you look. There are churches that go back 1,500 years.
That's beautiful.
Roman ruins which are back 2,000 years, and then you're down to the earthworks and things before that, which are even more mysterious and ancient.
Right.
And
how cool.
Yeah.
Well, tell us about the meteorite and the birth. Superheroes.
Well, with this again it's
Same
called
spot?
the Wold. Same spot. It's called the Wold Newton meteorite, and Wold Newton is a little village that's right in that area. And at the time, it was a big deal because it was the largest meteorite that had landed in England, and I think one of the largest in Europe that had actually been seen, because most meteorites land in the sea and are never seen, or they break up. And this great lump of stone came out of the sky on a Sunday afternoon and landed very close by a farm worker. So it was well chronicled and became an event. And the landowner where it landed, he took it off to London and exhibited it there. It's in the Science Museum. You can still see it. Or maybe the Geological Museum. Anyway, it's still in one of the London museums. And I say it was a big momentous event. However, fast forward a couple hundred years, and a science fiction writer called Philip Jose Farmer, he was writing sort of biographies of fictional superstars, and he was writing a biography of Tarzan. And he devised what he called the Wold-Newton family. And he built up this theory that when the meteorite came down, it spread radiation, which changed all the people who were nearby, which included a couple of coachloads of the gentry heading off to a supper somewhere. And these people included the Scarlet Pimpernel, they included the ancestors of Sherlock Holmes, they included the ancestors of Tarzan, they included basically the ancestors of every modern superhero. And it's just a wonderful story. That what intrigued me is such an obscure place, this part of the world, it's very thinly populated, such an obscure place, so much stuff going on there. And even to somebody several thousand miles away, thinking that'll be a good hook to hang a story on.
Yeah,
it's just intriguing that it goes on. So there's the what happened in real time there in reality, and then there's got this whole fictional life as well.
Oh, that is so fun. It just ripples out to touch everywhere in the world.
Yeah.
It sounds like it somehow rippled out to America as well with Thanksgiving and John Paul Jones.
Well, yeah, we've got those two stories. There is a property, Boynton Hall, and the family who built it, they made their money out of the turkey business. And the sort of patriarch of the family, he claimed he was a navigator on one of the Sebastian or John Cabot's early visits to North America, and he was responsible for bringing turkeys into the American wild turkey, bringing them into Europe and bringing them back to England. And the reality is he's probably the guy who fed them rather than actually did everything he claimed. But nevertheless, he got his hands on some very early turkeys and he built up a fortune from it. And he even had a special tower built so he could sit in there and watch all his turkeys that were out grazing across his land and see ships coming into the harbour that he knew would be going away with some of his turkeys. And they built a fortune on it. And the church there, the font is decorated with little turkeys and things, and it's the coat of arms. So again, who knew? The legend of the turkeys started there, because I mean, you have them for Thanksgiving. For us, it's very big for Christmas. The turkey is a major part of our diet still, and it all started there with this character living out there in the Wold Newton Triangle, getting a job on a boat and sailing off and going from there. And I say, you mentioned John Paul Jones. Well, the pointy bit of the triangle going out to sea is a big headland, very long headland called Flamborough Head. And it's got white limestone cliffs and see it from miles away. And that's where John Paul Jones had his famous sea battle with a British fleet of merchantmen and a couple of warships that were guarding them. And he was on the Bonhomme Richard, and it's where they were fighting away. And the British asked him if he was going to surrender, and he came out with the famous line, "Surrender? I haven't even begun fighting yet." And he eventually did actually win and beat the ship that wanted to capture him.
Wow.
Which was good, because his own ship subsequently sank, so he was able to take the other one and sail away.
Yeah.
But again, all the obscure places to come and have a sea battle, they came there at the corner of the Wold Newton Triangle.
It sounds like he was against great odds as well. Like, he shouldn't have probably won. Maybe I'm just making that up in my head.
Yeah,
you described all these ships. I'm like, that sounds like a big, lot of ships to fight.
Yeah, it was mainly a merchant fleet, so there were only a couple of big warships there. He did actually have some French ships with him, but who were allied, but they, as all the accounts said, didn't really want to get their hands dirty, so they stayed at a distance, saying, "Yeah, you tell them rotten English, yeah." And he did all the dirty work. And I say, his ship was completely smashed to pieces, and it sank the following day after the battle. But it was so close to the coast that people went from the local towns and they sat on the headland and watched the battle.
Wow.
Yeah,
real time
outdoor movie.
Yeah,
this is good.
Much better
you got the
than
popcorn.
TV.
Yes.
Oh, that is funny. I love that. I always just think of these ships and how much effort went into building them. And I mean, I guess we put that much effort into cars, and it feels like a boat is especially these old ships, were just so much more effort, time, resources, and then you just go out and battle and destroy them. Like, whatever you guys need to do.
Smash them to pieces.
Yeah, it seems like a lot to waste. I guess that's how battles go. Well, I'm really excited about this one. I've been waiting to ask you about this werewolf. I feel like werewolves are very, we have cryptids and werewolf things here in the United States as well, but I feel like they're a very like British and sort of thing. I don't know. Maybe that's just in my head.
They're really more of a European thing.
Okay.
I suppose it's because wolves became extinct in Britain a bit earlier than other parts. But I mean, werewolves are one of those cryptids, a bit like dragons, that are international. So they have them in the Far East, they have them in Russia, they have them obviously among the Native American cultures. Anywhere where there are wolves, there are legends of men who can change into wolves. And where they don't have wolves, it's usually another creature. In some parts, it's a bear. And in Africa, it tends to be a lion or something like that does the same thing. It's a human by day and a monster by night, a sort of shapeshifter. And I think that's the fascination of them. But well, again, we're back to the Wold-Newton triangle. And at one end of it, there used to be a hostel this was in the Middle Ages, for travelers. And it was at the bottom of a long cliff. And it was known that wolves, particularly in winter, would come off the hills down there into the valley where all the roads were, and they would prey on farm animals and people going around there. And these wolves were such a problem that they built a hostel there precisely so that people could stay there overnight, not be out on the roads and risking being attacked. So that's the sort of, if you like, is the factual bit with the real wolves that were there. But about the same time, a legend grew up of a wolf that was a sorcerer by day and then transformed into a wolf by night. And that this sorcerer would go around markets and towns and sort of gather who was moving and who would be on the road. And then at night, he'd transform into a wolf and lead his wolf back down, and they would attack the travelers. And this werewolf, the part sorcerer, part wolf, was known as Old Stinker, apparently because he had such a putrid breath, because obviously wolves eat carrion and things as well. And he's said to have two big orangey red eyes and a huge tail that was so powerful he could knock people over. So a legend grew up of Old Stinker the werewolf. And he lived in this part of the world, and supposedly in later years, he would climb in daylight. At dawn, he would climb into an abandoned tomb in a nearby churchyard and sleep there until the next time he came out. So I say I grew up with this story, and there were, when I was a teenager, people saying that they thought it was a car in the distance with its headlights, and when they approached, they realized it actually was a large wolf-like creature coming towards them. And, people saying, this big wolf animal attacked our car and knocked the side mirrors off it and so on. So I sort of grew up with that. And then, I say, all part of the Wold-Newton triangle. And then about 5 years ago, in another town in the same area as the crow flies or the werewolf runs, there started being reports of a large wolf-like creature haunting this town. And I got contacted by a newspaper, and I said, well, it's quite clearly Old Stinker who's come back from the dead again, and he's haunting the area. And a bit like the vampire in Highgate, it became one of these, mini 15 minutes of fame, attracted a lot of interest. People were out looking for this wolf. There were more and more reports of it coming in, haunting a particular, definitely spooky part of the town where it was being seen, town of Hull. And there's an old canal that goes through it. And because there are lots of factories around it, the water's quite polluted and tends to be steamy and smelly and has a definite atmosphere. So I got asked by one of the newspapers to go on a werewolf hunt on the night of a full moon to see if we could find anything. So we went.
Of course.
As you do. Has
to be on a full moon.
What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah. So how did it go?
Well, we did see some very strange marks on the riverbanks that looked like something very large had rushed through them or crushed all the undergrowth. And we did spot at the other side of the canal from us, I had a flashlight and shone it across, and it picked up 2 huge reddy orange eyes staring back at me.
Yikes.
And it followed us along the bank. It didn't sort of like, if you do shun it and it's something like a fox or something, they just run away and hide.
Yeah.
But it didn't. And it was definitely stalking us from the other side of the river. We were quite fortunate that we knew that it couldn't get across to us, or not very easily, because it was steep banks and a deep river between us. But it was very, very spooky. And I say, it just followed us along, watching us, and it wasn't showing any fear. And it was quite clearly a big animal, because you could tell by just how visible it was at night at a distance. It was something very big. And then it disappeared.
Wow.
And went.
So what do you think? Do you think it was the werewolf?
I think, to be honest, that it was probably a feral dog, that probably one of the bigger breeds that people have as pets, and then they become too expensive and too dangerous and they let them go. And there's certainly enough stuff in that part of the town with, old cafes and takeaways and stuff. There's certainly enough for it to scavenge. And from the reports, people were saying, my small poodle got dragged away by a big animal and eaten. It was probably picking up livestock. There'd certainly be rabbits there. There'd certainly be, well, probably wouldn't eat foxes, but there would certainly be rabbits and stuff that it could live on.
Yeah.
And I think it was a big feral animal that was on the prowl, and it was out hunting at night.
Yeah. And it may have even, especially if it had lived with humans before, seen you all and thought, maybe they'll drop something. Like maybe they'll.
Well, exactly. Yes. Yeah. Hang on. Just had a message come up on my screen telling me my computer was going to go to sleep in 9 minutes.
Oh, no. Yeah. We don't want that.
No.
Wrong timing.
Yeah. So, that I think, it was very intriguing, and there was definitely something out there, and it was definitely big, and you definitely wouldn't want to have bumped into it accidentally. You wanted to be where you were on the other side of the riverbank.
You didn't want to be maybe alone either. But I noticed you didn't take any silver bullets with you, which I don't even know if silver bullets would work. I think if you fired them, they just like melt, and I don't know. I'm not sure what would happen.
Yeah, well, we're in the UK, so you can't
have bullets.
Firearms.
That's true.
You can't have firearms anyway. But funnily enough, I did do some research into methods of killing werewolves, supposedly, and the silver bullets is really quite a late addition, and a lot of what we call werewolf lore all stems from those movies in the 1930s, The Werewolf of London and The Wolfman. And they have the thing that you shoot the werewolf with the bullet, and then as it dies, it returns to its human form. And I say a lot of what we now say, this is werewolf lore, was invented by some Hollywood scriptwriters. And I mean, there was an earlier tradition that you would shoot witches or suspected witches back where we were earlier, but with the Salem, but that you would shoot if you thought a witch was capable of shape-shifting, and there are a lot of legends about witches that turn into hares particularly, and go running around, that if you shot them with a silver bullet, it would kill them or wound them. And there's all these tales about somebody seeing a hare acting suspiciously. How a hare acts suspiciously, I don't know, but obviously. Gave him a funny look, perhaps.
But had a knife.
Had a knife, yes. And shot them. And then the next day, they learn that the old woman in the village, who everybody thought was a witch, had got a very bad leg injury. And they said, shot the woman. That was her. That was her. So, but I say the when you read the stories, because the Germans during the mass witchcraft trials of the 17th century, they were quite obsessed with werewolves, and there were a couple of cases of people who suffering from lycanthropy and thought they were werewolves and did attack people and sort of try to mutilate them as if they were a wolf eating somebody. And so they were quite obsessed with werewolves, but their view was that they were basically, as a werewolf, they were still just a wild animal. They weren't like a ghost or something supernatural. They were a type of transient cryptid, I suppose you'd call them.
Yeah.
And that you just use the weapons that you would use to hunt a normal wolf, you know, swords, axes, spears, and things of that nature.
So anything will do. Yeah.
Anything will do, but at a distance, because I say, I was reading up on it, and some people saying, oh, you stab them with a silver dagger. Now, a werewolf, well, a wolf is big. A werewolf is even bigger. You're going to stab them with a silver dagger. You've got to get awfully close to them.
Yeah.
It's only a little dagger. You know, you're right on them.
Yeah.
They're right on you. That's not really going to work. And you probably wouldn't with silver. You probably wouldn't get it through their coat anyway.
Yeah, that'd be rough. I wouldn't
It'd
want to
be rough.
try that.
Yeah. No. So no. Don't worry with the silver bullets. Save your silver.
Well, it's the same with the stake through the heart with the vampire too. I'm like, you're gonna get right in his embrace, right? Like go right up to his body, right there where he can grab you, bite you, whatever, and try to, you know. So I'm like, is this really how you kill a vampire? Is this what the vampire has put out as counter propaganda, or to get you to come that close in the first place? Which reminds me, you actually have a story in here too about a woman who is buried with a stake through her heart. Is that right?
Yes. That's not far again from where I am. And this was in the right up until the early years of the 19th century. Britain had this belief that people who'd committed certain types of crime, murder was one of them, suicide, which was classed as self-murder, was also one of them, that they shouldn't be buried in a Christian churchyard. They should be buried somewhere outside in unhallowed ground. And the most popular places were crossroads, because they were typically on the outside of the town. So you weren't going to be having, nasty murderers in your high street, but they were sort of sufficiently outside. And there was this belief that if you buried them there, if the ghost rose up at night, it would be greeted with 4 roads and it wouldn't know which way to go. And I say, you find in accounts people quite seriously saying the ghost would just basically stand there all night scratching its ghostly head. Do I go that way? Or that way? Or that way? Oh, the sun's come up. I'll have to go back again. I'll try again tomorrow. So that was the theory. You put them out there, and that to stop them walking, you would put a stake through the heart so that, again, they wouldn't be able to get up. And I say the particular one nearby here, there's a little village a little area, it's called Lush Bush. And it's supposedly because a man named Lush was a murderer who committed suicide, and he was buried there. And they put a stake through his heart, and that stake eventually grew into a tree, the bush. And it grew there at Lush Bush. And I say the last one here was, I think, in something like 1815. And it was a woman who'd committed suicide, and usual thing, people, very uncaring attitude. We can now see she probably did it she drowned her baby, and it's thought it was postnatal depression.
Yeah.
But of course, nobody cared about those things. Then she committed suicide, and so she was buried. And there's quite a detailed account of, after dark, and there were a couple of hundred people there watching, as they do. Ooh, we're going to bury somebody and put a stake through the heart.
Biggest thing that's going to happen this year.
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah, and she was buried there. But I say, going back to the Wold-Newton Triangle, there's a churchyard there, an old medieval churchyard that's been long abandoned, and that's been under investigation by archaeologists for many years. And relatively recently, they found in the graveyard that a number of bodies had been deliberately mutilated after death, and that their legs had been broken, and in some instances their heads had been cut off and put between their legs. And again, this was this belief that you didn't want the walking dead to walk and break the legs. You're talking quite a simplistic logic here.
Yeah.
But if you break somebody's legs, they're not going to walk, whether they're alive or dead, because how could they do that?
Yeah.
And if you chop the head off, they wouldn't know where they were going. And one of the other things they did was buried people face down, so that this was a belief in the resurrection, that when you're resurrected, you basically arise out of your tomb facing up towards the east. Whereas if you were face downwards, you wouldn't be able to do that. You'd be just stuck in the mud, and you'd stay there for all eternity. So I say, again, they found these bodies that had been deliberately mutilated after death to stop them walking.
The superstitions. They're so simplistic.
Superstitions,
Yeah.
how strong they were and how concerned they were. I say, when you read about the medieval times, we have ghosts, which are sort of misty things, and we have vampires and we have zombies. They had a thing called a revenant, which was like a physical ghost, and it was basically the body coming out of the grave. So it would sometimes seek other people's blood. So it was sort of part vampire, part zombie.
Yeah.
And they would return to their graves at dawn and come back, stay there during the day and then walk again at night. So I say that people were really actually very concerned about it and took it very seriously. It
just sounds like people are living in constant fear, actually. Like, you have to do this, and this, every dead body, and put them over there like that. And then if you're very, very lucky, you'll never get ripped apart in the middle of the night by some random ghoul, goblin, ghost, or otherwise.
Yeah, I think so.
It's a lot of work.
A lot of work, but there again, back in the Middle Ages, plenty of civil wars going on in England constantly, and your little peasant farmer, down come a bunch of armored knights to pinch your food and pinch your horses or take your cattle or whatever for food. Life could be very brutal. It was a very brutal time.
Yeah, that's a good point.
You've got to look at it at their perspective about it, and they were concerned about these things.
Yeah,
they were probably more in touch with the dead than we are, in the sense of, there'd be battle scenes with a pile of bodies there, and they'd still be there 20 years later, sort of thing. So they sort of grew up with this sort of slightly more gruesome.
Yeah, much more intimate with
life.
Death. That's a very good point. That makes a lot of sense. I'm just so glad that we're not doing that anymore. I think we could do better to have a little bit more of an awareness of death in our life. We just seem to push it away and hide it completely, and that's not healthy either. But maybe we have a balance in between those two states of being, and have some nice rationality and also an awareness of death. But I want to hear too, this is very exciting, about England's own Bigfoot, which is your next quest. Is that right?
Indeed, yes. When the weather gets a bit warmer and more pleasant, just in this part of the world, we have a thing called a wood woes. So it's wood as in a tree, Wose, W-O-S-E. And it's a kind of wild man. And curiously, a lot of the churches around here have carvings of the Wood Wose, and it's basically a big hairy man with a big hairy beard. And he looks for all the world like Bigfoot or Yeti. And there are tales of them being told over the years of people sighting these Wood Woses. And even today in certain, because where I now live is a very rural area again, and lots of woods and forests and relatively minor roads, and people are still reporting seeing a large creature shuffling across the road in front of them that wasn't a man and it wasn't a wild animal, and it looked like a big hairy beast like a gorilla or something. So it, and reports of people sort of out in their garden and a Wood Wose, this sort of big hairy monster sticks its head over the fence and has a look at them and then goes off again. So as I say, this legend of Wood Wose I find very intriguing, that we've got clearly a belief in that some form of wild man exists and has existed and still exists. I mean, you can understand it going way back in time, because there would have been displaced tribes with different invaders getting pushed out. There would have probably been a fairly disreputable looking bunch living in rags in old animal furs in a forest or something.
Yeah.
But the fact it still carries through to the present day makes you think, well, maybe there's something there. There's sufficient wild spaces around here that something could live there and thrive. So we'll see.
Yeah. That'll be so fun to hear about. This is another one that goes, internationally, in every space and every sort of culture and place. We see the same, legend. And I mean, could it just be, cultural dispersion throughout time, and that's how these have ended up with the similar stories, similar beings all over the world? Or is that some sort of evidence that they actually exist, right? That every place has this, like you said, the Yeti, the Bigfoot, and I've heard of the rock apes over in, I want to say, Southeast Asia and all kinds of places. Yeah. I mean, I suppose one idea is they could be either relics of one of the other streams of humanity. I mean, we now know that, there was us Homo sapiens, and before the Homo sapiens, there were the Neanderthal. And we now know that the Neanderthal and the Homo sapiens coexisted for a long time. But we also know, starting in relatively recently, we've been learning about more and more humanoid type, quite advanced civilizations. The little, one of the islands in Indonesia, they're called the hobbits, little, they found them, and the Denisovans in Russia, they were an existing species that coexisted, and there's recently been suggestions that another branch of the human race has been found, and we know that some of these species, maybe us, but our history may go back further than we thought. There's that ruins in Turkey with the name I can never remember. Göbekli Tepe?
That's the one.
Yeah.
That's the one where the suggestion is it's very, very ancient and predates all the existing building civilizations we know. Predates by several thousand years the Egyptians, predates other civilizations. So, it may well be that the human race isn't quite as, not the human race, but sort of the hominid family that we all belong to is a lot more complex than we thought, and that there may well be parts that we still haven't found of it and still haven't met, and that some of these creatures, Bigfoot, Yeti, Woodwoes, and the likes are living remnants of these ancient peoples, and they've managed to survive, and realizing keep out of the way of these awful
These
humans
psychopaths.
psychopathic
Yeah.
humans wandering around trying to take a picture on Facebook of everything.
Right.
So that, you know, they could be there. I think, you know, we're reaching that point where we previously thought, oh yeah, we've got history sorted out. It went like this, monkeys, and then we went to this, then we went to apes, then we went to the Neanderthals, and then we went to us. It's not as simple as that, and there's lots of other subspecies of which we've only just discovered them, so we don't even know how long they lived, what happened to them, what their range was. And there's a huge lot of empty spaces on the world where creatures can live.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, we're still finding new species of animals, you know, that we didn't know existed, or animals that we thought were extinct that are still alive. I mean, a good example is the coelacanth, the sort of armored fish that was thought to be extinct millions of years ago, gone with the dinosaurs. And then sort of in the 1930s, people started catching them off South Africa. It's now recognized they still exist and are still out there. And they thrived, but they sort of somehow managed to disappear off the fossil record. But it didn't mean that they'd gone. It's just that they'd moved somewhere else and we weren't leaving a trace. And I say it's the same with these human or semi-human species, you know, and we have these hobbits, as we call them. Well, were there other ones, and are they the source of legends about elves and dwarves and people like that? You know, again, that's a fairly widespread feature of European and other folklores, that there are these elder races, as they're often called, of little people or smaller than human people. Well, again, maybe they're not something mystical. They're just another branch of the human family that's kept away and kept hidden, and living somewhere else. So I think it's very exciting, because we're sort of, you know, science is pushing forward and discovering more stuff that's actually making what was previously just written off as folklore, making it actually more plausible. And that, you know, hey, no, it's not a fairy tale. There's a historical source behind it.
I love this. This is one of my most exciting, you know, thoughts that I can have, is to imagine all of that. I mean, the world is a huge place. The ocean is a very deep place. There's a lot of land, like you said. You know, we seem overpopulated because we live out of balance, really. But when you go driving in some places, like I drove through northern Canada, there's nothing for
nothing.
As far as you can see forever. You're driving for hours and hours and hours, and the whole time there's nothing. Yep. So that, I imagine, like, who and what could live out in that space. No one would ever know. You would never have to know, especially if they know about us and are trying to avoid us. And we're so loud and clumsy and stupid. Like, they could hear us coming from miles away and just...
Well, exactly. They could hear our cars, hear our music that's in the car. They can smell our cars. They know we're there. And they also know that the cars can't get off the road and drive up through a forest track,
right?
You know, a small forest track. So yeah, there's huge areas, and I mean, you know, we talk about the planet being overpopulated, but if you actually got all the people who are living today and put them in one spot, it'd be very crowded, obviously, but it wouldn't be that big a spot. You know,
yeah.
You know, we don't occupy our buildings and our roads and our infrastructure does, but there's huge parts. You know, there's not that many of us. And say Australia, it's enormous. I don't know if you've ever been to Australia, but when you fly back from there, the first section tends to be to Kuala Lumpur or somewhere like that for either a change or a refuel. And you are flying, and they have the flight map up there on the screen showing where you're going, and you're looking out the window, and you fly for hours and hours and hours just across empty desert. It's so big, it's enormous. And it's massive. If you put Australia on top of Europe, it would go all the way from Spain to Moscow, basically. Wow. It's huge. And we don't realize just how big it is, and there's nothing in the middle of it. And there are other places that are the same, the Himalayas, the all the deserts of Asia, masses of empty space there. South America, the jungles, there's huge areas we don't get to see. Canada, as you mentioned, huge areas, relatively unpopulated.
And my favorite is the entirety of Antarctica. No one gets to go there. I want to know what's there.
Yeah.
Well, that would be a whole entire discussion for another time. And this has been such a fun conversation, and I am sad that we have to draw it to an end, because I think you could probably tell us so many more stories. Excuse me. So I would love it if you ever want to come back again and tell us more stories. And I know you're working on some new things coming up, and you have some books that are already out that we've mentioned a few of them, but go ahead and tell us about your books, and then tell people where they can find you. The links are right below anywhere anyone's listening or watching, but I'd like to hear it as well.
Right. Well, the book on the Wold-Newton Triangle is called The Wold-Newton Triangle, and Yorkshire's Weird Wolves. Forgotten its own title. It's only available as an ebook. You can get it off Amazon in a straightforward Kindle and get it on any Amazon. My book on the sort of Saxon period, Saints and Sinners, is another ebook, and again, get that on Amazon. My latest book is called Shuckland, Shuckl, Shuckland, which is after Black Shuck, which is another creature we haven't had time to talk about. And that is available as an ebook on Amazon. And if you're in the UK, or you can contact me direct, I can supply it in a physical hard copy version. And that's about the folklore of the part of the world I live in now, which is East Anglia. And I'm currently working on a new book on witchcraft and sorcery. And it's going to be a sort of an encyclopedia of witches and sorcerers, and going from earliest times through to the modern day. So that'll be out hopefully later this year.
Ooh, that's exciting. So maybe you can come back when that is out and tell us more about...
Yeah, I would love to. I would love to. It's been a delight talking to you.
Excellent. Well, do you have anything else you want to share with people or invite them to before we go? And also, what are your final thoughts or ideas or words of wisdom that you want to leave people with?
I suppose my final thoughts are just investigate your local area, because you will find lots of intriguing stories and tales and bits of folklore. You don't have to head off to Cambodia or somewhere to see something mystical. There's lots of mysterious stuff around where everybody lives, and legends that have grown up and tall tales that are told, but most of them are usually based on a true story. And it doesn't matter whether you're in a town or a rural area, you will find there's something there. So there's always adventure and things to look for and things to intrigue. And I suppose the only other thing is to say, which I think you've got on the links, if anybody wants to contact me or find more about me, my website is www.urbanfantasist.com. And all my links are there, and you can go from there.
Oh, perfect and beautiful. I love that invitation too. Like you said, you don't have to go somewhere far. You can go in your own backyard and find some of these amazing stories as well. Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. And fellow travelers of the path, it is a beautiful thing. And this has been your analog electric concentric dose of wisdom according to the werewolf and wild thing hunter, Charles Christian. Charles, thank you so much for being here on Rogue Ways tonight.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you ever so much.
Yes. Well, time holds secrets scattered about like pieces of intrigue, calling our attention from this modern world of the materialist blandness. Remember that there is always more than meets the stethoscope and petri dish, and that only a mind still curious and willing to entertain the obscure and unfocused can find the point in the haystack of history. Hold it up to the light and find the truth. Gather the clues and remember to never be done imagining and thinking, and until you do, travel well, aim for balance, and always look inside first. Mwah.
Yeah. I ain't known all around the world. Shit, no one even heard of me halfway around the block. I just got an SOS from somebody's girl, begging for a photograph of my watch. Most don't know what time it is. I don't know whose mind this is. Snowing in my sinuses, the league is gonna find the kid. Administer punishment. Underwater drumming squids. Fuckers wanna pummel and toss them in the rubble bin. What a dumpster fire. Motherfucking why? Tried to fuse it in. If your thoughts are living, grow tired. Split have been a mouthpiece in your mental housing. Sent to finish bounties on everyone who's doubting. Well, there you have it, folks. There's the first round. Contestants know what they won. This insanity. God damn it, Chuck. Said tell them what they won. Took a little breather while we took a break. Went to a park and stole a rich kid's cake. Staking marijuana too, bumping some Nevada tunes. Washing down the clown with some of Svetlana's brew. Who the fuck are you? That's what they keep asking. Kevin Garvey on a beat, international assassin. Smashing like my life's at risk. Caskets for the brightest spit. Rip mics tell arthritis hits. Still might make a life of this. Never will concede my run. Clever with deleted funds. Ever undefeated punk professor of the beaten drum. Well, goddamn, that was embarrassing and hard to listen to.